On the third day, Jesus rose again. And for John, when writing this gospel, even though, obviously much nearer to what was happening than us, he would have known Jesus rose again on the third day. So when he wrote on the third day, he wasn't just telling us that it happened 3 days after the previous event. He was also saying something else. And we're going to leave that clue hanging there just for a minute. So why did he say on the third day? If it had been the fourth day, would he have bothered recording that? I suspect not, because there's no significance in it. But there is a reason for telling us on the third day. Just hear the next bit.
A wedding took place at Cana in Galilee.
Okay, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Probably here, simply factual information. Cana in Galilee, I'm sure that most of you know, Jesus' ministry took place largely in two geographical areas, mostly in the north where Galilee is. That's where he grew up, that's where he did a lot of his preaching and teaching and so forth. And then in the south, we've got Jerusalem, and we know the events that happened in Jerusalem. And particularly in Mark's Gospel, but most of the Gospels, there's a very distinct difference between what happens in the north in Galilee, and then he makes the decision, Jesus makes the decision to go to Jerusalem, knowing what would happen to him there. But for now, we're in Galilee, we're in Cana. It's a small town, it's an insignificant town, really. One of the disciples he's just called actually comes from Cana. It's near Galilee, but it's not on the Sea of Galilee. It's not right on the shores. It's very close to Nazareth. It's about 10 kilometres away from Nazareth. So this is home territory for Jesus. You know, this is a town very similar to the town that he's been living in for 30 years. Insignificant, ordinary people living there, and just where he feels at home, really. That's where this is set.
Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding.
Thank you. So the word also is there, but I'm not convinced that it really should be there. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples have been invited. So maybe there's a distinction there. Maybe Mary is there in some sort of role. Maybe she knew the bridegroom. Maybe she had a family connection. Maybe she had some sort of role to play in the catering or in what was being provided. So Mary was there. Jesus and his disciples were invited. This ties up, doesn't it, with what we know of Jesus. So many times you read in the Gospels that he sat down for a meal with people, sometimes his friends, sometimes people who are not so friendly, the opposition. He had a feast. He sort of enjoyed a good time, really. So, sometimes I think we picture Jesus as somebody a bit different, sort of set aside and so forth, which obviously is true, but also he was an ordinary human being as well, and enjoyed having fun, enjoyed going to weddings, enjoyed celebrations, having meals, and that's how local people saw him as well. They didn't sort of think, oh my goodness, we've got to invite Jesus, although he's always so boring and, doesn't join in and doesn't laugh at the jokes and so forth. He was invited. He was wanted there.
When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine."
So maybe this backs up the idea that Mary has got some sort of role. Otherwise, it's a bit odd that she's the person who sort of steps forward. So maybe she had some sort of role in the provision of drink or food or whatever it might be, something to do with the catering. And she goes to Jesus and says, "They have no more wine." Now, maybe this is simply something factual. The wine has run out, and she turns to Jesus. So maybe, like on the third day, this is just telling us something. Or maybe this is another clue. This is another clue to another layer of what is going on in John's account of this particular miracle. Maybe there is a double meaning. When she says they have no more wine, she is saying physically the wine has run out, but I wonder if underneath it she's also being recorded as saying something more than just they've run out of wine. To take the similar thing, if they'd run out of sausage rolls, would she have said they've run out of sausage rolls? Is it important that it's wine that we're talking? Actually, I cracked that joke before. It's a Jewish thing. They wouldn't have had sausage rolls. I do apologise. They could have been, yes. Or onion, vegetarian. Oh dear, all my training's gone out the window. Sorry, we'll turn to Jill.
Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied. My hour has not yet come.
Okay, in the commentaries, so much time is taken up over this word woman. It's as though everybody recoils from it. It's as though commentators are trying to explain away the idea that Jesus said, woman, why do you involve me? With that degree of irritation that half of the congregation may have heard, and half no, you would never have said that, I'm sure. So commentators are keen to point out, and it is important to say that it comes over as slightly irritated because of a translation. In the Greek, when you say woman, it has a gentleness to it. If we were to add the word dear woman, that would have a different sort of understanding, wouldn't it? One thing that I was really interested in is that if you know the story of when Jesus was on the cross and in front of him was Mary and in front of him was John himself, and he matched them up. Jesus was dying and he said to John, this is your mother, and to Mary, this is your son. A new human relationship was built there. And when he said to Mary, woman, here is your son, which we hear with care and love and compassion, don't we? That is exactly the same word as is used here. So what here comes over perhaps to us as a bit irritated, the same word is used when Jesus matches up John and Mary. So a lot of time is taken in the reading over looking at this word woman, and as I say, rightly so. But I think that it's something that's lost in translation, and also you don't hear him saying it. Tone of voice gives away a lot, doesn't it? However, my hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come. That is the thing that is really important about this section. My hour has not yet come. When John uses this phrase, when he records Jesus as saying it, it is always looking forward. My hour has not yet come until we get to the time of the cross, the time of the crucifixion, and that is when his hour has come. So again, this is one of these bigger clues. So on the third day, the wine has run out and my hour has not yet come. All of these sayings, all of these interactions, they have a resonance with what's going on, but I think that they're pointing to this bigger picture, this more important miracle that is taking place that nobody has any idea about at the time.
His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons.
We have a conflict here of imperial and metric. However it's measured, this is a vast amount of water, a really large amount of water, 6 containers holding so much of this water. And what's this water used for? This water is used for ceremonial washing. So for Jewish people to take part in the eating, the feasting, to take part in the wedding feast that's going on, you need to be ceremonially clean. And so this water was used for the ceremonial washing of hands, but also of the equipment that's used in terms of eating and drinking. So that would also have been washed in that water. We will know that some of this has been used because it's about to be filled up. So it's been used, and it's used by people over and over again, because they have to wash and then eat, and then they might go off and dancing or whatever else they do. For another meal, they come back, they have to wash again. And then they go off and then come back and wash again. So this is a continual thing that has to happen. It's not a one-off cleaning. It's done before every time food is consumed or drink is as well.
Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim.
Fill them to the brim. If you know Mark's Gospel, you know that it is full of little things like this. The feeding of the 5,000, he tells us that people sat down on the green grass. So little sort of hints that he really knew what was going on. And in some ways, this filling to the brim comes over in the same way. This is, he watched it, maybe, being filled to the brim. But even if he didn't see it, he heard the story and wrote it down for us. And this is a lovely picture, isn't it? This isn't a measly amount that's going on. It is filled absolutely to the brim and maybe overflowing as well. So this isn't this isn't a measly amount of what's going to happen. This is uncontainable, perhaps. Filled up to the very brim of this water.
Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew.
Okay, so the miracle has happened, and it's almost happened without us noticing. It's not as though Jesus said a prayer. It's not as though he did something. The water, the jars are filled to the brim, then it's taken to the person who's going to test it, and it's turned to wine. And, there's nothing, it's not God's power isn't called down, there's not the sharing of, the bread and the fishes, there's not the, as we'll learn later, putting things on somebody's eyes to make them see again. It's not the calling out of Lazarus from his grave. It's simply, this was water, now take it to the steward who drinks it, and it's wine. That miracle has sort of slipped in, as it were. And yet, obviously, really, really important, and so much we can learn from it. We'll see it in a moment, that almost in this last section, and as we talked about earlier, this is a sign. This is a sign. This is not a thing in itself. Water was turned to wine. Wonderful. Sort of doesn't really matter, does it? It was an amazing thing, but okay. The most important thing is that it tells us something about Jesus. It tells us of his concern for others. He tells us of his power over creation. It tells us of his relationship partly with his disciples and the other people who were there. So the turning of water to wine slipped in, not the most important thing. It's not even talked about as a miracle. John never talks about a miracle. Miracles are there as signs. What did they point the disciples to? What did they point Mary to? What did they point the other people there to? What do they point us to? And they point us to something about Jesus Christ.
Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now."
This is just true, isn't it? If you have people round in those days, a wedding feast could go on for a week, feeding a village for a week and keeping the wine going for a week. That's a tall order. And it's natural, isn't it, that you put out the best when people are, just arriving and they can, all their faculties are there. And then after a few days, at that point, you bring in something that's a little bit cheaper. And I read something the other day that the Queen stopped serving the best champagne and got champagne from Tesco's and said that it didn't matter because it was always wrapped in a white cloth, so nobody ever saw where it came from. So, the Queen does it as well, so bring out the champagne and then the cheaper stuff. So here we have a natural human story, don't we? This is what people do, but you have saved the best till last, not what is normally going to happen.
What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and
Okay, a couple of really significant things here. Signs we've talked about. It's not what happens in itself, it's what it points us to and our understanding. And by this he revealed his glory. He revealed his glory. In John's Gospel, Jesus' glory is seen in the resurrection, that is true, but the resurrection is completely linked as one event to the crucifixion. And Jesus' glory is seen at the point that he is put on the cross, where you would not expect, if you were to say God's glory, and you would say, the death of a person in a callous and cruel way, how is that God's glory? And yet this first sign, this first miracle, and indeed throughout John's Gospel, is pointing to God's glory. So what are the layers that we've got? We've got the layers of the event. This is what happened. A village wedding, the wine ran out, it was nearly a catastrophe. Jesus' mother steps in, Jesus steps in, and everyone lives happily ever after. That's one layer. Another layer is that this is a sign. This points us to who Jesus is. This is very early on in his ministry, that he's the Messiah. He has great control over creation, and his glory will be seen ultimately on the cross several years later. But I want to suggest to you that there's actually a third layer. So I apologise that this is quite hard work this morning, but let's just stick with it just for a moment or two longer. The idea of a wedding banquet, the idea of a wedding feast, is a strong one in Jewish understanding, looking forward to the future when the Messiah would return and all Jewish people will be gathered together in a banquet, in a feast. And alongside them would be the Messiah. The Messiah is seen as the bridegroom, and we see that in a number of the prophets. The Messiah, the bridegroom will be there, and all Jewish believers will be gathered together in a wedding banquet. So what have we got here? What I think we've got here is John telling us that under what actually happened, under the idea of a sign, we've got this sort of irony that Jesus is invited to a human wedding feast. And yet, John is telling us, in actual fact, he is the bridegroom. He's not just a human who's been given a wedding invitation and he turns up and helps out with the catering. He is actually the Messiah, the bridegroom, and he is sort of contained within a human wedding feast, and yet at the same time we see from John bursts of who he actually was. So why does he tell us it was the third day? It's because he wants us to see that the bridegroom will sort of be fulfilled on the third day when he rises again, looking ahead to that time. Why does he record Jesus as saying, "My hour has not yet come"? I mean, what on earth? Why did he say that? Mary says they've run out of wine. He says, "My hour has not yet come." I mean, those two don't link together unless you see this as Jesus being the bridegroom at a wedding feast and saying, "This isn't actually my hour, but I am the bridegroom." And when he talks about the time of his glory, again, he's looking ahead. And when they talk about the wine running out and being filled to the brim, what is the role of the bridegroom? The bridegroom has to provide the wine. And what does Jesus do? He provides the wine because he is the bridegroom. He is the person who has put to one side, or fulfilled, perhaps would be a better way of saying it, the Jewish law, the ceremonial stone jars that were needed to be refilled and refilled and refilled in order for people to be clean before God. And Jesus fulfills that in himself and says, this is what was going on in the human story, but I am the bridegroom and I will provide wine, the new life filled up to the brim. You know, it will overflow. There is so much of it in the new life that I, the bridegroom, will bring. So what to take away from this? The key thing, if I could suggest this, the key thing, if I could ask you to do this, is when you read John's Gospel, whether in a house group or whether you read it on your own, whether you dip into it or whether you read it in big sections, always think, what is John trying to tell us? Is this just a straightforward narrative? Or is there something he's telling us about Jesus? And once we've got hold of that, then look for another layer, and then another layer. Because John uses words so carefully. He's telling us so much about who Jesus was then, and who Jesus came to be, and who Jesus is for us today. Which brings us to the final verse. Sorry, which is just over the... It's right, it's here, I'll read it. This is entirely my fault. Just the verse before. Really sorry. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That's where we are. That's our role. We appear here as well, absolutely. We're there as well. His disciples, you and me. We see his glory. We watch his hour. We see him as the bridegroom, and we believe in him. Amen. Thank you very much, Jean.